It's 4 a.m. The world outside the house is silent. Inside, 4 lives are ending in the most violent way. The killer's steps echo through the darkness as the world outside remains blissfully unaware. The morning of November 13th, 2022, began like any other in Moscow, Idaho, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of the Palouse. A place where the worst crimes are often petty thefts or minor disturbances. A place where, for nearly 5 years, the community had not seen a single homicide. That morning, when the sun began to rise over the sleepy streets, the calm was shattered. The events leading to the brutal murders had unfolded just hours earlier. It was a typical Saturday night for college students. Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves, 2 lifelong friends, spent the night at a local bar. They were young, bright, and full of life. The Corner Club in downtown Moscow, where they drank, laughed, and made memories, was a familiar haunt. They'd been inseparable since childhood, with plans for the future already set. Move to Boise, start a new chapter together after graduation. At 1:30 a.m., they left the bar and grabbed a late-night bite from the Grub Truck, a food stand near campus, their final moments caught on a Twitch livestream. There, they waited for their ride. There, they were still laughing. They arrived home around 1:56 a.m., unaware that their lives would be violently stolen just over 2 hours later. Meanwhile, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, a young couple, were at a fraternity party on the University of Idaho campus. Xana was a student majoring in marketing. Ethan, her boyfriend, was a freshman, studying sports management. He had only recently joined the Sigma Chi fraternity. The two arrived home from the party around 1:45 a.m. Like the others, they had no idea that the night would soon turn into a nightmare. For all of them, the night had started like any other. It was around 4 a.m. when Xana received a DoorDash delivery at the house. She was awake, her phone screen glowing as she scrolled through TikTok, the one social media app so familiar to young adults. This was her last known activity, captured by her phone at 4:12 a.m. Her room was on the 2nd floor. The other girls were upstairs on the 3rd. At that moment, Bryan Kohberger was already on his way. Surveillance footage showed Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra moving past the King Road house at 3:29 a.m. It made multiple passes, the car's headlights cutting through the stillness, unnoticed by anyone. The footage captured him at 4:04 a.m., a final pass, before he parked nearby. At approximately 4:05 a.m., he entered the house, likely through the sliding glass door on the 2nd floor. The horror began in silence. His first stop, Madison's and Kaylee's room on the 3rd floor. They were sleeping in the same bed, as they often did. Best friends, closer than sisters. Kohberger attacked them both, stabbing them multiple times with a large, fixed-blade knife. Kaylee's body was found near Madison's. On the bed, the killer left something, a tan leather sheath for the knife, a piece of evidence that would prove to be his undoing. Afterward, Kohberger descended the stairs to the 2nd floor, where Xana and Ethan were. Xana had likely been disturbed and tried to fight back, her wounds showing signs of a struggle. Ethan was attacked next, likely caught off guard, stabbed in the same room. The brutality of the crime, sudden, swift, left no room for mercy. The walls of the house were spattered with blood, a horrific testament to the violence that had unfolded within. Dylan Mortensen, one of 2 surviving roommates, would be the only one to witness something from that night. She heard sounds from the floor above. At first, she thought it was Kaylee playing with her dog. But then she heard what she thought was a voice, Kaylee saying, "There's someone here." It wasn't clear who spoke those words, whether it was Kaylee or Xana, but Dylan, still groggy, opened her door. She didn't see anything. The second time she opened her door, she heard crying from Xana's room. She hesitated, listening, and then, disturbingly, a male voice. "It's okay, I'm going to help you," the voice said. Then, around 4:17 a.m., a neighbor's security camera recorded something chilling. Distant noises, distorted audio of what sounded like whimpering, followed by a loud thud. And then, the dog barked, again and again. The dog, unhurt, would become a silent witness to the brutal crime. Dylan, frozen in shock, saw him. A figure, cloaked in black, wearing a mask covering his mouth and nose. He was tall, 5 feet 10 inches or taller, athletically built, with bushy eyebrows. He walked past her door, leaving her paralyzed, too terrified to react. As the killer made his exit, Dylan locked herself in her room. The horrific discovery would not come until nearly 8 hours later. The surviving roommates, believing one of the victims on the second floor was merely unconscious, summoned friends to the house for help. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was placed from one of the surviving roommates' phones, reporting an unconscious person. The scene that greeted the police was one of devastation, with the bodies of 4 victims sprawled across the second and third floors. But one thing stood out. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was missing, just bodies, blood, and questions. The investigation had begun, but the journey to find the killer was still shrouded in uncertainty. Moscow, Idaho was a small town, and this kind of violence was unthinkable. Law enforcement, initially tight-lipped, began to process the scene, photographing, collecting evidence, and beginning the difficult work of tracking down every possible lead. The authorities were left grappling with the same question that haunted the victims' families. Why? What had motivated such an attack? And who was this man, a stranger to the victims, who could carry out such a brutal act? Was it simply a random, senseless crime? Or was there something more? The clock was ticking, but the answer, still elusive, was not yet in sight. There is no sign of forced entry. Nothing is missing. But 4 students are dead, and every minute that passes brings more questions, more grief, and more uncertainty. At the heart of it all, the most chilling fact of all, the killer left no trace of motive. It began as a tragedy. 4 young lives taken too soon, violently and inexplicably. For days, the Moscow Police Department released few details. The community was left in shock, grappling with the loss of 4 beloved students. And yet, here they were, investigators searching for answers, while the city waited for someone to make sense of it all. The first few days after the murders were filled with confusion and fear. Initial statements from law enforcement suggested that the attack was targeted, but the fear was palpable. Students left campus early, many choosing to stay with family. Some professors canceled classes. Despite the reassurances, the town was filled with whispers. Who would do such a thing? Was there a motive, or was this just a random act of violence? On November 16th, Moscow Police Chief James Fry held a press conference, publicly stating,
"Targeted attack on our victims. We do not have a suspect at this time, and that individual is still out there. We cannot say
that there is no threat to the community." This was not the answer the town had hoped for. The uncertainty was eating away at the residents, turning a peaceful college town into a place of unease. For the families of the victims, every minute without answers felt like a cruel punishment. Kaylee Goncalves' father, Steve, became one of the most vocal advocates for justice. The lack of transparency only fueled his grief, and he made it clear that he wanted answers. The pain of not knowing why their loved ones had been targeted weighed heavily on the families. In his own public statements, Steve demanded more from law enforcement: clarity, action, and accountability. "I just want to know why my daughter is dead," Steve said in one of his first interviews. He wasn't alone in his frustrations. The other families echoed this sentiment, the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what had led to the deaths of their children consuming them. Then, on November 25th, 2022, a break. The police issued a public appeal for information on a white Hyundai Elantra, initially described as a 2011 to 2013 model, but later expanded to include models up to 2016. Surveillance footage had captured the car driving past the King Road house multiple times during the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. The car made several passes in the hour before the murders, adding an eerie rhythm to the timeline of events. The investigation into the vehicle became the central focus. A key feature: the car lacked a front license plate. It seemed like a minor detail, but it would become one of the most significant pieces of the puzzle. By November 29, 2022, investigators had narrowed the search. A white Hyundai Elantra had been registered to Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old Ph.D. student from Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Pullman, just 8 miles across the state line from Moscow, was Kohberger's home base. The discovery was chilling. Kohberger was no longer just a suspect. He was the focus of the investigation. But who was Bryan Kohberger? And what connection did he have to the victims? He was a criminology Ph.D. student, deeply immersed in the very study of the criminal mind. At DeSales University, his graduate thesis explored the thoughts and feelings of criminals as they committed their offenses. It was a chilling irony. Someone so focused on understanding crime was now at the center of one of the most brutal crimes in the country. Court filings would later reveal that Kohberger had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and developmental coordination disorder. His defense team planned to argue these conditions explained his awkward social interactions and courtroom demeanor, while prosecutors viewed his obsessive behaviors, like meticulously cleaning his car after the murders, as a calculated effort to destroy evidence. Unsettling accounts from those who knew him began to surface. One woman claimed to have matched with him on Tinder, where he allegedly asked her if being stabbed was like being killed with a K-bar, a detail that made her deeply uncomfortable. Then, investigators dug deeper into Kohberger's phone records. Cell tower data revealed a disturbing pattern. His phone had pinged off towers near the victim's home on at least 12 occasions prior to the murders, predominantly during late night and early morning hours. It was as though he had been tracking their movements, almost obsessively. The most crucial discovery came in the form of physical evidence. Investigators recovered a tan leather knife sheath near the bodies of Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves. Forensic scientists at the Idaho State Lab discovered a single source of male DNA on the sheath's button snap. The breakthrough was monumental. The FBI employed a cutting-edge technique known as investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, uploading the unknown profile to public genealogy databases to build a family tree. On December 19, 2022, this process led them to a name, Bryan Kohberger. To confirm the IgG result, investigators conducted a trash pull at Kohberger's family home in Pennsylvania on December 27th. From the trash, a Q-tip was recovered. The DNA on it belonged to Kohberger's father, and it was a near certain familial match to the DNA on the sheath. As the investigation intensified, so did public speculation. Online sleuths pointed to a Facebook user named Papa Roger, who posted eerily prescient comments in a discussion group, including a theory that the killer must have left a knife sheath at the scene, a detail not yet public. The account went silent after Kohberger's arrest, fueling unconfirmed theories that the killer had been hiding in plain sight, anonymously discussing his own crime. On December 30th, 2022, Kohberger was arrested in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, in the early morning hours. The FBI's tactical team, working with state police, executed the warrant. Kohberger, who had been under surveillance for days, was arrested at his parents' home. He was cooperative, but his arrest brought no closure, just more questions. Why had he done this? What had driven him to commit such a brutal crime? And why had he targeted these 4 students who had no known connection to him? As investigators pieced together the evidence, one question remained. Why? The murder weapon itself was never found. The case was far from closed. With Kohberger in custody, the investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. But for now, the question of why, the most fundamental and painful question of all, lingered in the air, unresolved. Bryan Kohberger remained silent. He had yet to speak. His motives were still a mystery. The case was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about understanding the mind of a killer. For over a year and a half, Bryan Kohberger had remained silent. His reasons for the deaths of 4 college students, his choice to take their lives, remained a mystery. The families of the victims sought answers, but he offered none. On July 23, 2025, Kohberger finally faced the consequences of his actions, but still, he refused to speak. The arrest of Bryan Kohberger in late 2022 was the culmination of weeks of painstaking investigation. For the families of the victims, it brought some measure of relief, a name, a suspect. But with that relief came a growing sense of frustration. The most basic question, the one that gnawed at them since the night of the murders, remained unanswered. Why did he do this? There had been no connection between Kohberger and the victims. No history, no apparent motive. This wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It felt like a violation of everything the families had known about their children, their lives, their worlds. Steve Goncalves, father of Kaylee, had been vocal from the start.
I don't think he was even out of the driveway before my kids turned around and looked at me and said, "What do we do, Dad?" I told him.
He said what so many felt. We still don't know why my daughter is dead. Kohberger's silence became a central feature of the case. His refusal to provide an explanation in his initial court appearances sent ripples through the courtroom. When asked to enter a plea, Kohberger chose to stand silent. A judge entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, but the silence was deafening. His behavior seemed deliberate. A man who had studied criminology, who had spent years learning about the criminal mind, was now the very criminal he had once sought to understand. The court issued a sweeping gag order, preventing attorneys and law enforcement from speaking publicly to protect Kohberger's right to a fair trial amidst a media frenzy. This left the families holding out hope for a trial, faced with the haunting possibility that they might never know the truth. As the trial date approached, the defense, led by public defender Ann Taylor, prepared its strategy. Their primary plan was to introduce 4 alternate perpetrators, 3 friends socially connected to the victims, and a 4th individual who had a brief, passing encounter with one of them weeks earlier. However, on June 26, 2025, that strategy was decisively dismantled. Judge Stephen Hippler issued a critical ruling blocking the defense from presenting this theory, stating there was no compelling evidence to support it. With their main defense gutted, Kohberger's team contacted prosecutors the very next day to begin plea negotiations. On July 2, 2025, the case took its dramatic turn. Kohberger agreed to a plea deal, pleading guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. In exchange for his guilty plea, the prosecution agreed to withdraw the death penalty. Kohberger would serve 4 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. And crucially, he waived all rights to an appeal. For the families, the plea deal brought conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was the finality of it. No more drawn-out trials. But on the other hand, they were robbed of the opportunity for a trial that could have finally revealed the truth. The response to the plea deal was divided. Ethan Chapin's family and Madison Mogen's family publicly expressed support for the deal, recognizing that it spared them from the decades of appeals that often accompany death penalty cases. Their focus was on moving forward, on honoring the memories of their loved ones without the constant toll of a prolonged legal battle. But not all the families felt that way. Kaylee Goncalves' family, particularly her father Steve, was vehemently opposed to the deal. They believed that the plea robbed them of the chance to truly understand why their daughter was killed. To Steve Goncalves, the plea deal felt like an erosion of their right to confront the truth. On July 23, 2025, Kohberger was formally sentenced. He stood in his orange jumpsuit, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. When given the opportunity to speak, Kohberger simply said, "I respectfully decline." Judge Stephen Hippler acknowledged the immense pain caused by Kohberger's actions. "I share the desire expressed by others to understand the why," he said, his voice filled with gravity. The words cut through the room, echoing the emotional toll the case had taken on everyone involved. It was the family's impact statements that would truly capture the emotional weight of the moment. Kaylee's father, Steve, stood in front of the courtroom, his voice strong but filled with grief.
They had your DNA, like a calling card. You were that careless, that foolish, that stupid.
"You were that careless, that foolish. You were a joke," he said, his eyes locked on Kohberger. "You picked the wrong family, and we're laughing at you on your way to the pen." A statement from Madison's mother, Karen Laramie, was read aloud. "Any one of us would have given our own life to have been outshone by hers." Kaylee Goncalves, Kaylee's sister, delivered a searing condemnation that drew applause from the courtroom. "You're a coward. You're a delusional, pathetic, hypochondriac loser. For the survivors, the trauma was still fresh. Dylan Mortensen, the roommate who had witnessed Kohberger leaving the house that night, spoke in a voice thick with emotion. He shattered me in ways I didn't think were possible. I learned how to survive, but I will never be the same. Bryan Kohberger's silence remained unbroken. His refusal to speak may have been his last act of control, his final refusal to give the families the closure they so deserved. In the end, Kohberger's silence stood as a symbol of everything he had taken. There was no confession, no apology, and no closure. Just the raw, undeniable truth. 4 young lives had been lost, and the person who had taken them was now, forever, silent. The case was closed, but the question that haunted every moment of the investigation, why, would remain unanswered. The killer was behind bars, but for those who had loved and lost, the pain would never fully subside. The finality of the sentence couldn't undo the deep scars that would forever remain. And so, the story ends, with a question still hanging in the air.